So good morning. I had to answer my first question, which was, do you want to be recorded before we can get started? So if you clear that button, we'll get rolling. But welcome to the Virginia version of the EPA Grant Success Workshop with the West Virginia TAB provider for EPA and US EPA. So you're lucky you're not going to hear a lot from me, but you're going to hear about grant success from the real experts today. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we put this on and who it's for. So if you're from Virginia, we like to see you bring EPA federal dollars to Virginia. If you're not from Virginia, this is still a very applicable website. You're not in the wrong class. And we do welcome success from our neighboring states. So thank you for joining in. But Mia Anderson and I make up the Brownfields program at Virginia DEQ. And one of the things that we do is we try to get out into all the communities. Before COVID, we actually went out into all the communities to help bring Brownfields tools to each community, help design Brownfields resources that they can use to kind of enhance and revitalize their Brownfield sites. Mead coined that BIO, Brownfields Individualized Outreach. A big part of that, and one of the big tools, is the EPA grants. EPA Brownfields grants, have been really, really useful for Brownfield communities in Virginia. And folks that have gotten planning and assessment grants we've seen the most of have really used that to leverage additional resources like our Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund. So in Virginia, we actually have a grant program in which you can get an EPA grant and essentially spend that money and use it as a match to the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund. So grants are one big tool. People love money, right? So that's why you're here. And Mead is going to talk briefly about the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund and how that works, just to further inspire you to go after this EPA money we're going to talk about today. So Mead.
Thank you, Vince, and thanks everybody for joining us today. The Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund was created in 2002, and no monies were put in it until 2011. At that time, $500,000 was placed into that account, and we were able to start developing guidelines and dispersing funds. Currently, we are getting $2.25 million a year. That's been fairly consistent over the last several years. There's two types of grants: assessment and planning up to $50,000, and remediation grants up to $500,000. To date, we have dispersed $12,557,939 into communities across Virginia, and it's been pretty widely dispersed. I don't have a slide in the deck right now that shows those locations, but we've done well with getting it out. There's a number of cities and communities that have been really good at utilizing these. Lynchburg, Danville, Martinsville, Pulaski are four that come to mind. We have 160 grant commitments so far, and we have a number in line right now that we're reviewing. 132 of those are assessment and planning, 28 are remediation. There is a one-to-one match with these grants. That can be challenging at times when you're just getting started, but we're pretty flexible on that match. Contact us to discuss what can be used for a match. Assessment and planning grants are a great way to get started in a Brownfields grant community or pattern plan, because it gives you some money to start with. You don't have to start with $50,000. You could start with 20 if you've got a match and you've got a project that you can pair up with that. It's also good on your EPA grants to see that there's work that's been done. And if you get an EPA grant, you can use that as a match to the Virginia VBAF grant. So Vince, take it over, please.
Yeah, so, and I thought that was important, because as you're dreaming about your EPA grant success and that award you're going to get next spring, go ahead and add a multiplier, because Mead and I will help you actually increase that amount and dedicate that to your program through some of the other Virginia tools and technical assistance. So that's really all we have. I really encourage people to go after these. If you're on the fence, just go, dive in. You can do it. I wrote a grant twice and have been successful, so I know you can do it too. So don't hesitate. The worst thing that can happen is you get close and then next year you get the grant. So get started if you've never went after one, and we'll be here to support you. And I'm gonna turn it back over to Carrie, and she's gonna get us started.
Thanks, Vince and Mead. All right, so we had a little bit of introductions from the Virginia folks, and we're going to hear today from myself and Gianna Rosati from the US EPA Region 3, and I'll let her introduce herself when we get into it. But first, we're going to get started with some overview on some technical assistance resources, primarily through the TAB program. So technical assistance to brownfields is a program through the US EPA that provides technical assistance to communities and stakeholders on brownfield sites to help increase understanding, to help ultimately redevelop sites. And each region has a TAB provider that is funded by the US EPA through a grant. It is completely, all of our services are completely free to the users. And we are excited to be the new TAB provider at West Virginia University. And I can tell you a little bit more about what our focus is going to be through these services. Our key partners are the Brownfields Assistance Center at WVU, which I am the director of, and we have been providing technical assistance on brownfields for 16 years in West Virginia, and we're very excited to take what we've learned here and reach out into the rest of the region. We are partnering with our landscape architecture program at WVU, who's going to be providing some project-specific support each year, and you can learn more about that later, and also by reaching out to me. And then we're also partnering with our School of Public Health, who's going to help us do some evaluation of the program, as well as some case studies around the impacts of brownfields and the built environment on public health. So our key resources are going to be in 4 categories: brownfields education, which is like what we're doing today, webinars and trainings and events when we're all able to get back together again around any number of topics, including grant writing, but also other brownfield hot topics as we go. Resource identification, which includes grant writing assistance. We can review your grant, we can help you troubleshoot and answer questions about different sections on a one-on-one basis. In addition to these webinars, we can do grant review and then also help with resource roadmaps. We'll also be working on some local brownfield program support through building inventory developments, developing inventories of brownfields in local communities, answering your questions on sites, and other technical support as needed. And then finally, that project development and design assistance that will primarily be through the Davis College of Design, but also just one-off sort of hotline questions. We'll have an email address and a phone number that you can call if you have specific questions on a site where we can be responsive to what exactly it is that you are looking for. EPA also funds some other technical assistance resources. Groundwork USA is the provider for environmental justice and equitable development resources. You can check their website to see a lot of great reports and webinars that they have hosted and will be hosting. The Hazardous Materials Training and Research Institute has some more technical resources available. And then the University of Louisville has developed a Brownfields benefits tool. And all of those links are live, and you will receive these slides after the webinar so that you'll be able to check those out on your own. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gianna.
All right, thanks, Carrie. So hello, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar and some new names. I'm Gianna Rosati. I have been in the Brownfields program in EPA Region 3 for about 7 years. I oversee the National Assessment Revolving Loan Fund and Cleanup Grant Competition for our region. And I'm also acting as the Virginia State Contact. So if you have any brownfield or grant competition related questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. All right, so first we're going to just provide an overview of the different types of grants available this year, and then we can delve into more detail on eligibility and what goes into each application. So first, we'll start with our assessment grants. We have site-specific, which is exactly as the name implies. It's for assessment funding on one site, up to $200,000. For certain sites that are large in size, complexity, and contamination, a waiver can be requested for up to $350,000 per site. We also have community-wide, which are our most common assessment grants. They can be used on multiple sites throughout a community and a target area. And this year it's been increased up to $500,000 per grant. New this year, very new, for state and tribal organizations, they can apply up to $2 million for an assessment grant, and they'll be used over a 5-year grant period compared to our normal 3. And so next we'll get into our cleanup grants. And eligible entities that can apply include state, local, tribal governments, general purpose units of local government, regional council and redevelopment agencies, quasi-governmental agencies, and important to note are nonprofit organizations. So entities can apply, the same entities can apply for cleanup and assessment grants, but there's other requirements required for these cleanups. So we'll get into more on cleanups. Ownership eligibility. So as the applicant, you must be the sole owner of the site by the time you submit your application. And throughout this whole presentation, you might hear application and proposal mixed, but they mean the same thing. So as the sole owner, you must have conducted all appropriate inquiries prior to acquiring the site, which includes a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And it has to be done within 180 days of acquiring the site. So if it was done 8 months ago and you just acquired the site, it would have to be redone to come in for our grant. And another aspect is that the owner must not be liable or affiliated with anyone that's potentially liable for the contamination.
Gianna, we had a question. Would you mind to tell Caroline a little bit more about the site-specific waiver?
For assessments, sure. So if you can prove that the site is very large, there's some sites that are ½ acre, some sites that are 100 acres. And so for those larger sites where there's more known contamination and there's more complexities, it's been used for over 100,000 years for industrial purposes, that could constitute a waiver for the assessments. And it goes similarly with the cleanups. So for assessments, you can do up to $350,000 for a waiver. And for the cleanups, it's up to $650,000. And so you can apply for the waiver. They're not always granted, but if you have a site that fits those needs, you can certainly try. And then if you get only the $200,000 or the $500,000 for the cleanup, it's better than nothing. And then with the cleanups, also important to note the 20% cost share over the 3-year grant period. So if you come in for $500,000, it's 20% of that, or if you come in for less, it would go corresponding with that number.
Thank you.
All right.
So is there a match for the site-specific assessments?
No, there's no cost share for assessments.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so eligible use for funding on cleanup sites includes obviously the site cleanup for either a single or multiple sites, program reporting, cleanup oversight, environmental monitoring, and redevelopment planning are all eligible. And like I said, it's up to $500,000 per grant, possibly $650,000 if you apply for the waiver with the 20% cost share, and it's over a 3-year period. And our third grant we have this year are revolving loan funds, also known as RLF. And these are grants that can provide loans and subgrants for cleanup activities at brownfield sites. They're up to $1 million per eligible entity. Also have the 20% cost share over a 5-year grant period instead of the usual 3. And RLF applicants can come in as an individual entity or as an RLF coalition. If you have a bigger target area and partners that aren't able to come in on their own, don't have enough capacity to come in for an RLF on their own, you can partner up and that's eligible. Also with RLF this year, if you have a current open RLF grant, you're not eligible to come in for a new RLF. But for those that are high performing recipients, you can come in for supplemental funding after the FY22 art competition concludes, which is in the springtime usually. Certain recipients will receive an extension of their current grant, or EPA can deem it as a new RLF grant with that supplemental funding. Okay, so now we'll get into a bit more of the application details, now that you know the different types of funding available. And so first, I'm assuming most of our audience have looked at grants.gov before for our solicitation. That's where you can find the full guidelines and resources besides our EPA OBLR website. But for grants.gov, you have to have a DUNS number. And if you're not familiar with this, it might be something that you already have, but just aren't aware of. And so this requires the tax identification number and organization information. You can check with your city, county clerk, your grant writer or manager, but it's definitely something to do as early as possible in this process. As sometimes there's complications that can come up with, other entities under a similar name or your authorized user. So definitely be sure to check your DUNS number, and I'll pass it over to Carrie for SAM.gov.
Thanks, Gianna. So once you have your DUNS number, you need that in order to set up your SAM.gov account. And SAM.gov is the system for award management that the US government uses for basically any entity it's doing business with, including grants. So you have to register here to do that business with the US government. You may need to update or renew your registration. You can check the status of your registration or other registrations and just get more information in general. So just like.
But I will note that in Virginia, we have seen people not actually lose a grant because the DUNS and the SAM.gov was not all right. It wasn't the right entity, and they were confused because they were related entities. So this is really important that you pay attention to Carrie's. May seem very administrative, but it can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars.
That is for sure. So you, just like the DUNS number, you may already have this. If your organization or your city or county has applied for any kind of federal funding before, not just EPA, you may already have that, and you can check with the leadership of your organization. Sometimes the city or county clerk will have this, the city manager, or if you have a grant writer or a manager, they may have that information. So in order to apply for a SAM.gov, you'll need your DUNS number, your tax identification number, and then your banking information, because this is, again, how they get all your information for transferring those funds should you get selected. So the reason we talk about this now, and the reason we're saying that it's so important, is that this is not an instant registration process. Once you enter all of this information, the SAM.gov office will verify everything that you've submitted, and it can take up to 2 to 3 weeks or even longer for that to happen. So you do not want to get to the very last day on December 1st when the grants are due and find out that you've got a problem with your SAM.gov, because it is incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to resolve it in time. And I have personally worked with applicants that had really solid applications, I thought, who got to the day of submission and discovered that there was an issue with their SAM.gov and there was just nothing we can do. So it's really important to make sure that you start on this. And this is something that WVU TAB can help you with. I have helped many organizations. It's my sort of personal soapbox to make sure that there's not an administrative reason why you can't apply. So you definitely want to look into that right away. You do have to renew and update it every year. So you want to make sure that not only you have it right this second, but that it will still be active on that deadline day, which is December 1st. You want to make sure that the contact information is up to date, so you don't have folks who've moved on to new positions are the contact people and you can't get access to it. And to clarify, it is completely free to register and to renew your account information. Once you're in there, you may get, there are a lot of scams and spam out there about helping you renew for $350. None of those are legitimate. There is no reason you need to pay anyone to help you renew. If for some reason you can't figure out how to renew on your own, I will help you for not $350, for $0. So definitely watch out for those scams, but also make sure that you are up to date when you are applying for your grant. Right.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Garrett and Vince. I would I really stress the SAM and DUNS number. It can really get delayed. Surprising that government entities and these giant websites take a long time, but sometimes they can cause major delays. So check on that now if you are remotely interested in applying. As they said, it's free, and there are some websites out there that look for a credit card number. So stay away from those. But now we'll get into what goes into our applications. And so first, there's two parts. There's the threshold criteria and then the ranking information that goes into your narrative actual proposal. For the threshold, it's very basic information. It's like your your contact information about the site. And this is all reviewed before proposals get further along in our process, just to make sure it's an eligible entity, it's an eligible site for cleanups or site specific. Before we get further along, there is a window of time to clarify information. So if it looks like a document is missing and it's completely accidental, it wasn't overlooked, then we can reach out, EPA can reach out to these applicants and try to get the missing information. We really do try to make it work, but for certain cases where the SAMS number, SAMS.gov registration or DUNS number isn't up to date, that's a bit out of our control. That needs to be done ahead of time. So part of this threshold criteria includes narrative information sheets. And so like I mentioned, it's your applicant information, name, full address, type of funding requested, amount of funding requested, your target area. And so this year, a slight change for anyone looking at census tracts smaller than a city or a town, we're asking that you list the census tract numbers. So we increased the page limit here from 2 to 3 pages if there are a lot of census tracts that you need to cover. Again, property specific information, your contact population. And one thing to note here for other factors, this can be confusing to some people who aren't familiar, but when we get further along in the competition and we have the highest ranked proposals or applications, the EPA headquarters selection official may consider other factors as appropriate based on their priorities. So applicants can provide a summary in their narrative section later on in the proposal on applicable other factors and note the corresponding page number. So that is this other factors checklist. It's a table of the list of other factors and a page number of where it can be found in your application. And the other factors have not changed much from other years. Examples include community population that's less than 2,000 or 10,000, I'm sorry. Priority site that is impacted by mine scarred land, priority sites that's adjacent to a body of water or a federally designated floodplain. And so if you meet any of these other factors, make a statement in your narrative. You can fit that in somewhere between all of your sections. And then you note the page number. And if it comes down to a few different grants that are all at the same score and you have other factors, then you would be a more eligible applicant for selection. And another part of this narrative information sheet is the state environmental authority letter. And so that would be your DEQ contact Vince. Vince, do you want to talk at all about this?
Yeah, I'm trying to get unmuted. So and sorry, my daughter's in here bouncing around. But so I write those letters, get them to me early. So your request should be what your project is, the contact you want on the letter, and a short summary of your project, because I like to learn about it, one, and personalize the letter slightly. I don't know that EPA cares that much as long as I write a support letter, but get those to me early so we're not up against the last minute getting those out. And I'm gonna turn it back to Gianna because my daughter is wanting to put glasses on me. See you.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Yeah, so let's get into the narrative criteria. And this first section covers the project area description and plans for revitalization. This first part is really describing your target area and brownfields. You want to provide a cultural and industrial description of your community that demonstrates the brownfield challenges and the impact that they have had on your community. You want to describe specific area or areas, depending on what you're targeting, where your work will be performed. Applicants are encouraged, but not required to include data from EPA's EJ screen or other EJ-focused geospatial mapping tools in your narrative to help characterize and describe the target area and the community or community needs or populations. Not so much the need in this section, but we'll get into that later on. And the data can include sources from studies, the census, third-party reports, and can also be included to give a more complete picture of your impacted community and population. So you want to describe the priority brownfield site or sites. There's usually more than one, especially for assessments. Identify and describe your brownfield sites. So, for reviewers that are reading these applications, they might not have any idea of what your area is like. They might be from across the country. So paint that picture for them, acting like you're not remotely close with this at all. And so for assessment, you want to describe the priority site or sites and why it's a priority for assessment and redevelopment. And for cleanup, you want to describe the targeted cleanup site. Besides that, you want to go into the past and current land uses, current site conditions, including existing structures, potentially related environmental issues, if you're aware of that. And especially for cleanup, you want to describe the priority site contamination, because you should know that by now. And so then we have revitalization of the target area. And so a change to note this year is that there's no longer language for applicants to provide information on the overall plan and how it will affect opportunity zones. That's the key word here. Opportunity zones are no longer a priority for these applications. So you want to cover here your revitalization of the target area. And so look at reuse strategy and alignment with greater revitalization plans, whether it's on a town or a county or a state level. You want to look for other plans that this project really ties into. And so also the outcomes and benefit of this reuse strategy. So describe the potential of the project and the revitalization plan, how it will stimulate economic development, facilitate non-economic benefits, whether it's green space or whatever the project is, you want to describe that here. And if applicable, you can describe how the redevelopment of the priority site will facilitate renewable energy and incorporate energy efficiency measures. And lastly, for this section, you want to cover your strategy for leveraging resources. So this is resources beyond the EPA grant and resources needed for the site reuse. So besides this EPA grant, usually there's other funding that's required to get this to the end goal. So your eligibility for monetary funding from other resources, such as VBAF, delve into as many other possibilities. If you have secured funding already in place, even better, you want to list that here. For cleanups, you want to describe the funding that's been secured and attach that documentation that substantiates your commitments. So we don't expect everyone to have a strong commitment for additional funding beyond this EPA grant. It's usually used as, seed money as a beginning phase of this project. But if you do have firm commitments, that would be great to include here. And also the use of existing infrastructure. Obviously, that's a no-brainer. It makes sense. So if you have this on your sites, whether assessment or cleanup, you want to describe that here. So how this grant will facilitate the use of existing infrastructure at the priority site or within the target area. And if additional infrastructure needs are key for the revitalization plans, describe the infrastructure needs and the funding resources that will be sought to implement that work. And that pretty much covers this section. This is part 1 of the narrative criteria. Part 2 will be community need and community engagement, and I'll pass that to Carrie.
Thanks, Gianna. Before I jump into the community need and engagement, I think that Gianna said this earlier, but I just want to stress that if you are applying for the cost share waiver for a cleanup grant, you do still need in that last section to describe how you would leverage cost share in case that you would be denied the cost share waiver, but awarded your grant. So you want to still have a plan in place for how you would come up with your cost share in the case that your waiver is denied. So that's just important to remember. All right. So community need and engagement, this is where you're going to talk about why your community needs this funding. Maybe why can you not do it on your own? Maybe there's been a downturn. If you're a municipal government or a county government, there's been a downturn in tax revenue. You know, this was not a priority for your before, and now it has become a priority, so it wasn't budgeted for. And just generally, why is the community in need of this funding? You also want to talk about how you are engaging the broader community in the project. And so this is important to, this is an important section that I've seen folks get hung up on before. So you want to make sure that you're listing all of your project partners, but that you are listing project partners and their roles. So one change in recent years has been that there's no need for letters of support. EPA will not review letters of support, so you don't need to submit them, but you do want to talk about who are your partners and how have you already engaged them and what will their roles be. So just listing sort of all of the community organizations in your community that have nothing to do with your project is not going to help your application. You want to make sure that you are talking about how they're going to be engaged and what their role is going to be in your project. And then how are you going to incorporate community input, both from those identified partners, but also from the broader community at large. And you want to make sure that you're talking about not just government entities, not just your city council or your county commission, but also other community groups like maybe some civic groups like the Lions Club or any of those sort of volunteer and other community groups that are in there. And the other thing to remember is that there may be some groups that are specific to your reuse plan. So if you're reusing a site, turning it into a recreational facility of some sort, then you may have soccer clubs that would be a relevant partner group that you're going to be engaging regularly. Whereas if you're turning it into an industrial park, then obviously the soccer groups are not going to be as
Carrie, I think Dale Hendon had a question maybe that was related to something we just covered.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dale.
I actually did not have a question. I'm preempting that I will have a question in this segment. So I'm just trying to get ahead, team.
Yeah, we're going to jump into a question section in just a few seconds, and we're going to have a quiz while you're thinking of your questions. So go ahead and start thinking about them.
I think we're small enough of a group. If you really have a burning question, put it in the chat, and I'll be happy to interrupt Carrie. So if she doesn't give you the evil eye, or Gianna, thank you.
That's great. And I think also once we get into questions, we have a small enough group that if you really want to say it out loud instead of typing it, we can probably manage that as well. So yeah, so this community need and engagement is an important part to make sure that you're truly showing how you're going to engage the community throughout the process, not just how you may have engaged them up to this point. So for a cleanup grant, in your threshold criteria, you're going to have done some community notification processes. And that is very important, but also you want to continue to engage the community throughout the life of your project. All right. So with that, we will take some questions. And then while you're thinking of your fantastic question, to either put in the chat, or if you'd like to say it out loud, you can use the raise hand function, which is under the reactions in your black toolbar. I'm going to run a couple of questions to see how we're doing so far. So go ahead. And this first question is, which of the following services are provided by WVU TAB? And it is multiple choice. So you can select multiple checkboxes there. I hope that's what I told it to do. So take a second to fill that out while you're thinking of your questions.
Time to wake up and click your buttons.
Right. You will not be graded. This is really grading us for how well we explained it to you. So.
But daydreaming about that grant award I talked about.
Great. We'll take a couple more seconds and you can go ahead and be thinking about your questions. I'm not seeing any in the public chat, but maybe Vince or Katie, you're saying some directly to you, if that's true.
So I will say that in Virginia, we've always had a good TAB provider that's been underutilized, I think, to some degree. And we hope with Carrie coming on board, she already has strong relationships in Virginia with us and a lot of the communities, that you will use this free, too good to be true, free service more to help you have brownfield success. So, after this, engage Carrie to see, how she can help you and your communities move forward with your brownfield program.
Makes sense. Yeah, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about specifically what we can do on these grants. After you hear all the information, we can talk about which pieces are a good fit for TAB to help with.
I am going to interrupt now if you're all right with that.
Sure.
So in the COVID, Delta variant, all these factors coming into play, especially with the community engagement piece of this, have you seen creative ways that individuals have written that into their grant on how they're going to communicate given the circumstances or anything? Or kind of, I guess I'm asking, community surveys online, drive-through town halls. I don't know. What are some good ideas that we've seen out there that we could potentially consider for grant narratives?
Do you want me to start, you guys? Yeah, so I have seen a lot of, I think some of the things you're talking about are very good. I think what's most important for community engagement, and this is my sort of passion area generally, is community engagement, is that it's all locally based, right? So it's what's appropriate in your community, what's working in your community. So there's lots of good best practices out there, and sometimes it's just kind of trial and error to see what your community is going to be the most receptive to. So I think we've seen a lot of moving to Zoom like we are today, right? A lot of moving online, but you want to make sure that there are still some accessibility issues, right? There's accessibility issues with any community engagement that you're going to do. If we're in person, there's a childcare accessibility issue, there may be a work schedule accessibility issue. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about that in your local community. And then usually the best way to kind of deal with that is to offer multiple modes of engagement, right? So maybe some passive ways that people can engage with you by sharing information through social media, so then they can be asynchronized, right? So they can give you feedback when they don't have to be at a certain place at a certain time or in front of a computer at a certain time. Maybe having, I've seen some creative things outdoors, right? Now that we know that it is safer to be outside, as opposed to at the very beginning of all this when we just didn't know, figuring out ways to do things outside, that may be possible. And then generally my advice on community engagement is where possible to go where people already are, right? So instead of asking them to come to a specific meeting just about this one, frankly, very niche topic, right? Brownfields are my everyday life all day, every day, but it's very niche for most people. If there's already stuff happening, already places where community members are gathering, you're going to hit people that maybe wouldn't have come to just your meeting. But if they're already gathering either physically or virtually, if you can reach out to them where they already are, then that can both help you reach a broader part of the population, and then frankly makes it easier on you because you're not organizing a whole other thing. I don't know, Vince, if you've seen anything.
Yeah, I mean, we've got, DEQ has several different types of grants, including a 104K grant. And when COVID first hit, we switched to a Zoom platform for communities in Southwest Virginia, up in a mountainous community where people usually like to get together. And I was actually shocked that we actually had, in that region, we actually had really good participation in the Zoom platform. I think people understand that. I think EPA understands in the grants that you're going to have to include some of that, and they're going to want to see that you're flexible to move between those platforms. We had another one because it fit a community better. We did outdoors, socially distanced, picnic area in a park that really worked well for that community. And that was done appropriate with health protocols at the time. So I think you hit it on the head, Carrie. It's like, make sure EPA understands, one, you are ready to engage the public because it's very important. Two, that you're flexible to move based on current pandemic health conditions from one platform to the other. I think if you write that into a grant, then you're probably not going to lose points for public engagement. But Gianna, I mean, what did you see last cycle for creative?
Yeah, I would completely agree with what you both said. It's a little bit of trial and error, and important for that section is to know, so if you're doing or proposing to do community meetings one way, explain why that's beneficial and why that's worked in the past. So if you're doing a hybrid of social media and Zoom meetings, and then you have smaller in-person meetings, if you can explain that we've tried this in the past and it was really successful, and that's why we're going to do this for our Brownfields project, that's pretty key. You can, propose a few different strategies of going about this, but as a reviewer, you might be wondering, well, why are they proposing this if, it hasn't been tried in the past and we don't know if that's going to be effective? So looking at that, and I really agree with combining with other meetings, whether it's like a grassroots church community meeting or some type of local advisory board with business owners. There's really a few different ways to go about it. And so depending on how you do go about it, trying to explain the rationale behind it is important.
Yeah, we tagged on to wildly popular community yearly events or, weekend, Friday cheers type events could be good. I mean, somewhere where people are, just to make sure you touch more people. That's a pretty good idea. And one tool online we've been using in our grants lately is Social Pinpoint, which is another tool to really get people hands-on to help you gather information in a community. That might be something worth looking at too for different folks looking at virtual options.
That's a great note. Yeah, I think that's a great note. I think also when you're writing that section, similar to what Gianna's saying about you've tried this before, if you already are sort of integrated in a community, if you are engaging that community, you don't want to spend too much of your space, because you don't have a lot of space, talking about what you've already done, but that does kind of show your chops, right? Like, we are a genuinely engaged part of a community, and we're going to continue those relationships with this grant. Is going to make it sort of more genuine and clear, I think.
You may already have a group that's like a revitalization committee or something that can quickly become a Brownfields committee.
Yeah.
Think about that. We had one community, the playground committee became the Brownfields committee. So, I mean, there's different, things out there. Just be creative, write concisely, don't waste space, and then make sure EPA understands what you're doing and how it's going to work and how it's going to be effective.
Great. So we do have another question in the chat. Stephanie is asking, is there a typical number of priority sites that reviewers are looking for in a community-wide assessment grant, especially given the maximum amount is going up?
Yeah, so I can start with that. There's no minimum or maximum amount of priority sites for that section. With the larger grant amounts, though, I think a big aspect to touch on this year will be your prioritization of future sites that are not included in your proposal. So it's not exactly quantity over quality. I would say if you have 2 to 4 priority sites already lined up, you want to do your best job at explaining them. And then with that additional funding, since it is a lot more than in the past, make sure to explain clearly your process for selecting sites in the future beyond what you explained. I don't know if Carrie or Vince, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's good. I think it's important to remember, I've had to go over this with communities, that the target sites that you include in your grant are important, and they're important because it shows that you've already identified sites, that there are sites in your community, but those are not, it does not mean that those are the only sites you're going to be able to assess whenever you get your grant. That's just sort of, and it doesn't mean that you have to assess those sites. Many things can happen, right? It's going to be almost a year from when you write your grant to when you actually get the money. So any number of things could have happened on the sites that you genuinely thought you were going to evaluate at the beginning. And so just keep that in mind whenever you're writing and thinking about it and stressing about it, right? And then the other thing that I was going to say was that although there's not a maximum on the sites, you can, I don't know that we talked too much, Gianna, about the non-assessment activities that you can do with an assessment grant. So there are some other activities that you can do, but they do still want you to be doing mostly assessment work, right, Gianna?
Right, yeah, that's a really good point. So we do want to spend the majority, usually at least 50% of the grant funds on actual assessment work, like phase 1s and phase 2s. But with the rest of the grant funding, you can use it for cleanup, reuse planning, market studies, there's a lot of different planning activities, and we have that later on in the presentation. We have a whole EPA website for planning activities that are eligible under our assessment grants. So that's another big aspect to keep in mind. If you have a large area that you really don't know what the best reuse for it, these assessment funds can be used to figure out what's going on at the sites, and then also look at what's the best way to revitalize and figure out the next reuse for them.
Great. Thank you. I don't see any other questions, but so I'm just going to share our results from our first poll. So the first question about which services does WVU TAB provide? And the answer is actually all of these. So we're still building those up right now, and we're really focused on the first two as we just gear up. We are just becoming your TAB provider, but we will be also expanding into those last two very soon. And then we're going to do one more poll question while you make sure you don't have any other questions to ask at this stage. So this question is a true or false. EPA Brownfields assessment grants can be provided for inventories, planning, assessments, community outreach, entire communities, and or states or tribal lands. I did not time this for Gianna to have just told you this, but
that was a very nice segue.
Hopefully it will help you
If you know
answer.
the answer, you can refresh your coffee and get ready for the next section of learning.
That's
Get
right.
that extra point in.
That's right. So as you're answering that, Carolyn says, someone mentioned a particular website for community engagement. What was that? I think that you're talking about the social pinpoint site that Vince mentioned.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned, I think, and I'll try to put a link to it, even though everybody can Google it. I'll put a link in the chat.
Right. And then Gianna mentioned that later we're going to have some information on those planning activities. And we do have a slide that there's some really great, EPA has some really great resources on their website. And we have a slide that will take you directly to those so that you don't have to search around for them. All right, I'm going to end the poll. So this is true. EPA assessment grants can be used for all of these things. And there are different grants for specific sites, entire communities, and as we heard earlier, for the first time, these state or tribal targeted grants. All right, nice job. We'll have another quiz in just a little bit. All right. All right, I think I'm still up, right, Jenna? So there's two more sections of the grant narrative criteria that we're going to talk about. So up next is part 3, which is your task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. So your task descriptions and cleanups only, you're going to include your proposed cleanup plan, which will outline what your plan is for the site, describe the contamination issues, how you're going to clean those up, and how they'll be disposed of. And so as part of your threshold criteria, you'll have, for a cleanup only, you'll have included an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives that goes through some different ways and options for how you could clean up the site. And that's how you'll sort of indicate which alternative you have selected. But the reviewers of your narrative criteria are not going to be reviewing and evaluating that as part of the scoring process. So you should not assume that they know what is in there. You can, however, pull some of that information into this section of the grant so that you can give some of those details. And I have seen projects get hung up on that, where they don't put enough detail in this section because they think it's all in the APCA, but the reviewer hasn't seen that, so they weren't able to review that. So that's an important piece. Your APCA is going to be much longer than you want to include in this section because you do only have 10 pages for the full application. So you want to make sure that you're making the best use of that space. but definitely pull some of that detail as opposed to assuming that it's been read otherwise. So then you want to include in your task descriptions, these are the descriptions of how you're going to implement this grant overall. You want to include your project implementation plan, your anticipated project schedule, who is the lead for each of those tasks and activities, and what are the outputs associated. And we have some examples for how you can share that will pop up soon. And a duplicate slide for some reason. All right, so that can be sound like a lot of information and could take up a lot of space, but this is just an example on the top of how you might include the task information and what level of detail you want to include. So you'll see this is kind of a cost estimate, the in-kind labor, which may be part of your cleanup cost share, that you're guessing it's about 16 hours of staff a month, and this is how you're rating that or valuing that. And that comes to $23,040. And then your contractual costs lay out an estimate of how much a phase 1 assessment costs and how many you're going to do. Same for asbestos surveys, for example, lead-based paint surveys. And so that's the kind of level of detail that you want to include so that the reviewers can know exactly how you're going to be spending that money. And then the second example is more for a cleanup. It talks about your how you might do reuse and marketing plans, what your staff costs there would be, etc. So you can include in-kind costs as part of your cost share in a cleanup, and you may even, so I've worked with very small applicants who are all volunteer staff, for example, a watershed association in Central West Virginia that successfully applied for a cleanup grant, but they don't pay their staff, so they were able to use that in-kind volunteer labor. But you want to show, if you're using something like that, you want to show how you got that cost. So for example, for volunteer labor, there's the independent sector, which values that each year by state and nationwide. And that's something I can help you find if you need that as part of your grant writing. But you want to make sure that you are including how you came to those cost estimates in this section. I've also seen grants get held up by that. So when you're talking about the cleanup costs or you're talking about disposal costs, you want to include a little bit of narrative about where you got those numbers from. And then on the bottom, you'll see an example project budget table. This follows the sample table format that is given to you by EPA in the guidelines. And while they don't require it, I strongly recommend that if EPA gives you a sample format, you use it, because then the reviewers are going to be very used to seeing it. And so it will make it easier for them to review, and they won't have as high a chance of getting confused by your including a different format than what they're used to, because you should remember that the reviewers are reviewing quite a lot of grants. Gianna can probably tell you how many, but they're looking at a lot of them. So any way you can make it easy for them to follow along. And that reminds me that what I usually say at the top is that you may be familiar with writing other grants where it's just important that you tell the story and give them the information that they're looking for, however you do it. For EPA grants, it is important that you give it to them the way they ask for it, where they ask for it. So you want to go through and answer question 1A, call it that, and give them your answer where they want it and ask for it, because if it's in a different section, you are not going to get the points that you're looking for. Because
Carrie, I have a question. So for grants where there's no match, is it important for those to include the leverage, hours, the cost, where you're showing like in this in-kind labor? Is that important to EPA? And maybe that's a Gianna question. As a reviewer, you want to see that? Or
If you have committed resources that are in kind, I would absolutely encourage you to include that. I think that just strengthens your proposal and your project. If you don't, you don't have to come up with it, but I would mention potential resources that you can pursue if you do get the grant. And I would just stress one thing that Carrie pointed out that has changed over the years in our request for applications, but the information in each section has to have that response in that section, that information. So if you cover something that might go and fit for different sections, you want to make sure if the request for applications and the guidelines are asking for a response in one certain section to have that in there. And if you repeat yourself, then that's fine. It's better to repeat yourself than not have it covered and risk losing points in that section.
And one potential leverage resource in Virginia is always going to be the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund. I think most people realize that and sneak that into their grant somewhere, but that's just something to keep in mind as a potential resource. I just asked because the in-kind labor, you know, some people might get confused on whether the match, you need it on a grant that doesn't ask for the match. But like you, I always think it's good to show, because reviewers are people, right? So they are looking at every little detail, but they're also going, oh, wow, this one, I feel better about this one being a success. So
Yeah, even though this grant is very early on in the whole reuse and revitalization process, it does help to show that you've thought this through, you've explored your options, and you can note that here.
That's great. Thanks. All right. Our final section is the programmatic capability and past performance section. So in this section for programmatic capability, you're going to want to talk about your organizational structure. How are you structured overall, and how will the team that's implementing this grant be structured? Who's your project manager? How are decisions being made? Discuss those key staff that will work together to implement the grant and what their backgrounds are very briefly. And then also discuss what your systems are in place to acquire any additional expertise or resources that you might need. So this is not just how you're going to acquire other money, but if you need some other expertise that you don't currently have in your team, how will you identify and acquire that? And then the final piece of this section is the past performance and accomplishments. So on this question, you're going to have 3 options to answer under. You're going to answer numbers 1, 2, or 3 on here. You're not going to do more than one. So the first one is, the first category are folks who have currently have an EPA grant, Brownfield grant, or have previously received an EPA Brownfield grant. And if you select that, you're going to tell them about that grant, how it went, what were the outcomes, were you on time with reporting, etc. How much money was it, what was it for? If you have not received an EPA grant, but you have received any other kind of grant, it can be a federal grant, it could be the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund, it could be a much smaller grant. You're going to answer similar questions to the first one, but it's going to be about those. If you're an organization that has received a lot of grants, you want to pick a few examples. I think they asked for 3 that are recent and that, if possible, have some relevance, right? That may be a similar kind of project. It's probably not going to be another assessment grant. There's not a lot of people besides state environmental agencies and the EPA who are funding assessment, but if it's some other kind of revitalization or development grant of some sort, you want to talk about that. If you have never received any money from anywhere, then you're going to do option 3 and you'll just state that that is true. But if you select that, then you're going to receive a neutral number of points. And so I would strongly recommend that if you have really never received funding from anyone ever, I personally would not recommend starting with an EPA grant because it's going to be really, really difficult. It's not a great place to start. You might start with the Virginia Brownfield Fund. You might start with a targeted Brownfield assessment grant, which we didn't talk about much today, but Gianna and I both, and Vince as well, couldn't talk to you about that. But it's going to make it very difficult to implement. It's also going to make your application not as competitive as if you have answered the 1 or 2. But what I would say is that even if you're not thinking of funding that you've received as a grant, there may be a way to get creative in answering that number 2, right? Because you have managed money that's come from an external source, and that's what they're looking for. They want to know that you're able to manage money that has come from somewhere. And so you want to try really hard to be able to answer one of those first 2 options. And I can help you answer questions about that while we're here together, or also as a follow-up to this conversation.
Yeah, and just one thing to note before we move on, if there's a section that you feel you can't answer fully, like say you have never received any outside funding before, make sure you address that. I would not recommend, leaving that kind of open. It's better, even if you haven't or really can't fully answer it, to address it and how you plan to address it in the future. You don't want to leave anything blank here for our responses.
Yeah, I think that's a great note. The other thing I would say overall, as you're going through, I mentioned a couple of times sort of the points in each section. If you look deep in the sort of past the narrative criteria and into the ranking criteria, the guidelines tell you how many points each question is worth. And that can be very useful in helping you figure out how much you should say in a section, right? So you only have 10 pages. And if a section is only worth 5 points, then you probably don't want to give it 2 pages of answer, right? So that's a good way to help you figure out how much you should be answering in each section. And then I find it really helpful when I'm helping grants trim, right? So generally my way of writing is to write it all. And then if it's too long, you can always cut it back. And so when you go back to cut, you can kind of see, well, I really spent a lot of time talking about this thing that's only going to get me 5 points. I should probably trim it back. So yeah, that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, and so we mentioned our EPA Brownfield Grant website. And so this, I think, would be a starting point for most applicants. It has a lot of resources, including the FY22 competition changes compared to last year. And it's in a really nice, concise table. So you can go through each section and it has an overview. So that's a great starting point. There's also frequently asked questions and answers. The guidelines are also there, and the link to the grants.gov solicitation. I would definitely recommend exploring that page as a starter. And then we also have a website on eligible planning activities. It's like, I think, a 2-pager on 10 different planning activities that you might have not thought of as eligible under our assessment grants, but it's worth exploring. And then, of course, common environmental contaminants and health impacts is really good to include in your proposals, regardless of what type. So I would check that out. And I also mentioned before, I believe, the EJ screen and mapping tool. The full name is the Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool and Enviro Atlas. So those are 2 somewhat newer tools you might not be familiar with, but it can be really helpful for these applications in demonstrating community need, environmental justice aspects, a lot of different layers and things to toy around with that can be useful to include. And for each of those sites, the EJ Screen and Enviro Atlas, if you go to their web pages, there's a bunch of user tutorial guides as well as training for different levels that are recorded. So if you feel a little overwhelmed, you can just kind of delve into that a little bit and get a little bit more acclimated. It definitely has useful information to include. And then, of course, the US Census Bureau for your population and demographic information.
All right, so now that you've heard all about what goes into a grant, we'll just come back really quickly to TAB and how we can help you. So specifically to Brownfield grants, we will definitely be available to review grant application drafts. And so we'll be putting out, and I'll share with this group directly for sure, kind of when we need to get it by to make sure that we can get you comments back in time that you'll be able to make adjustments before you submit. We can also follow up with you if you after you've digested all this information or you're looking through the guidelines, you have a question or need clarification about different sections or your eligibility. We can help you navigate that. I do have a graduate assistant who is wicked fast at gathering data from some of those sites that we just talked about. So we may be able to help you with some of that, or helping to point you in the right direction for where you might look for that information. And then, of course, my soapbox about SAM.gov and grants.gov. We didn't talk a lot about grants.gov, but once you have your SAM.gov login, you do also have to have grants.gov, and there's a little bit of nuance on making sure that you're an authorized user to be able to submit on behalf of your organization, and we can help you with that. And then if there's something beyond our expertise level, we can help direct you to the right resources at grants.gov, which does have some really good documentation about how to use their site. So
I would emphasize take up Carrie and WVU as a resource. It's free and it's so helpful. It can't hurt to have someone look over your proposal, no matter how draft version it is. And also emphasize the SAM.gov. There seems to always be some glitches and some things that happen where it can cause weeks on delay. And each year, unfortunately, we have to turn away proposals that are submitted either on the deadline or they try to be submitted through a headquarters email. And it's because of technical issues with SAM.gov or grants.gov. And it really, they have gotten very picky on what they will allow after that deadline. And so I think last year we had 4 or 5 applicants where we could not accept their proposal. And it's so tough that you've come all this way and put so much work into it. And then due to a submittal issue, we can't accept it. So please take that into an important note.
Yes, one of those was one I assisted and it was heartbreaking. So it's very hard to pour all your heart into your application and then get tossed out on a technicality. So make sure you're getting that lined up.
And a good reason to take advantage of the grant review is because, you know, these grants are very competitive, and Virginia over the last 5 years has done really well above national average on actually winning grants, but they can help. You have to write an A+ to get funded. So you may have an A and they'll find you that 1 point you need to get an A+. So it's really coming down to the little fine points and things that they've seen over and over. And Carrie's been involved in writing lots of successful grants. So why not take advantage of her and her team who know how to do this and find you that extra point? And EPA wants you to do that because that's why they have the TAB providers. So
yeah, and I like to think I try to think like a reviewer when I'm doing it. I won't be doing it by myself, but I have the guidelines up beside me and I'm just going through line by line to make sure you're hitting all the questions and that it's not confusing. And for Virginia, I'm not like a reviewer. I'm not going to be as familiar with your sites yet because I'm just getting started working with Virginia. So that's it's good to have somebody's eyes that are fresh, that don't already know what it is you're trying to say, to see if your writing is clear. So
I personally use TAB providers on both the grants I've written. We'll continue to do that each year. So I'm not telling you to do something that I won't do.
All right, so we're going to stop again for questions, and I'm going to, while you're thinking of those questions and dropping them in the chat, I'm going to run a couple another polls to see how we're learning. The next two are going to be about cleanup grants. So this first one is another true or false. EPA Brownfield cleanup grants can be provided to entities that do not own the property at the time of application. Take a minute to do that, and also take a second to ask some questions. So we have a question from Stephanie. I've heard it's best to use the most recent and most accurate data, for example, 2020 official census data. This official data doesn't have to have information for certain levels of localities, for example, towns. Is it best to use the ACS, the American Communities Survey data for those cases, or should we be consistent and use that throughout the entire application? I don't know, Gianna, if you have an official.
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think for areas that are not covered with the official census data, down to census tracts or micro communities, I would try to look at EJ Screen, the environmental justice screening tool, and EnviroAtlas for any additional information you might be able to pull. It is hard for reviewers that are not familiar with your area to understand how small of a census tract or target area it might be. So I don't think you have to be completely consistent throughout the entire application, but the more specific information, the better.
Yeah, I was going to say similar, that I think up to date is good and good data is good, and just making sure it's clear where that came from each time, so that doesn't get, because it can get confusing. But if you just quickly, and nobody's looking for anyone who had to write papers in college, nobody's looking to make sure that you consistently cite in exactly the right MLA format or APA format. They just want to make sure that it's cited, right? They just want to know where it came from. So I use personally, I've used a lot of footnotes with just links, because that seems to be the most space.
Yep, that works.
Appropriate. Right. Great. All right, go ahead and keep asking those questions in the chat, and I will share this first poll. So this is false. You must own the property at the time of application and have completed all appropriate inquiry and all of your due diligence appropriately in order to apply for a cleanup grant. You do not, however, have to own sites for the assessment grants at all. There is no ownership required You do need to cooperate with your owners once you're actually assessing the sites, but that is an issue to be dealt with once you actually have the grant. All right, our last, go ahead.
Virginia specific tidbit is, so in Virginia, under the Virginia Brownfields Assistance Fund, we have up to $500,000 remediation grants in which the locality can apply for even if they don't own the property, which is different from the EPA grant. So if you're in one of those situations, talk to me or myself and we'll help try to get you a state grant. And you can, if you've done assessment and planning with your grant from EPA, you can use that toward the match. So that is one difference between the two programs here in Virginia.
That's great. All right, true or false? EPA cleanup grants require a 20% cost share. And while you're doing that, Wayne's asked a great question. When is the deadline? That's crucial.
Very good question. I'm sorry we didn't mention that already. It's going to be by midnight, December 1st of this year, 2021. And please do not wait until the deadline.
Correct.
I've been telling folks, you want to enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, so why not get the grant ready and in by Thanksgiving? You know, give yourself a week to breathe. I know that doesn't always happen, but that's a good target.
It is.
Yeah, even if you can get most of the proposal done and then submit it to WVU for a review, and then you can, you know, tweak it between those few weeks. But I would definitely recommend not waiting around. And one thing to note while we're mentioning deadline dates, for cleanup grants, there is a required community notification and community meeting. And so for anyone interested in coming in for a cleanup, there is a 2-week minimum requirement for your community notification, which includes sharing your proposal if asked, and a lot of other project information. And then the community meeting itself can be combined with other community meetings, like we've mentioned before. And it's helpful to incorporate that community input that you solicit for. So you don't want to wait before the day of submitting your proposal. So I recommend doing it at least a few days ahead. But the community meeting itself can be done between that 2-week period of the community notification and when you submit your proposal.
Yeah, so it's important to remember when you're setting that, when you do that notification, that if you do get done early, but it's not been 2 weeks since you had that notification, you still need to wait to hit that submit button until it has been 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So you don't want
So
to
if
get
you
hung up on
submit,
that.
if you submit your proposal, if you're planning to do it earlier than the December 1st deadline, your community notification has to be 2 weeks before that date. And that was actually an issue in our region last year, and the application was not able to be submitted.
Carrie, what's your deadline for, you probably mentioned it earlier, but your TAB review, grant review deadline?
We haven't set that yet, but I will send it out in our follow-up to this. I'm going to set that later this week. But we're going to need a few weeks to make sure that we have time to give you that information back, and to make sure we have time. I don't have, this is our first year, right? So I don't have a sense of how many we might get. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time.
Yeah, if you're planning to do that, you know, go ahead and tell Carrie that you will.
Yes.
Now. That way she can start planning for that and have a better idea. And she can also, you can start engaging because she and you have contact, you know, y'all have a contact. So
That's
do that after this session.
Yeah, and my contact information is going to be on the last slide. And one other thing I would say about timing and the deadline is that we've talked a lot about how sam.gov may take too long and go wrong. Grants.gov is also known to crash from time to time. So when Gianna says don't wait till that last minute, you don't want to be at 11:30 on the 1st and then something goes wrong with the system because it's overloaded. I've had that happen to me, not on EPA grants, but on other grants. So you want to make sure that you're giving yourself time to allow for grants.gov having an issue itself. There
was some downtime last year when we were trying.
Yeah, and it's not usually convenient for applicants.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So our results on this one, EPA cleanup grants require 20% cost share. Vince, what's the answer?
I'm on mute. So the answer is true unless you can apply for and receive a waiver.
Nuance, excellent. But Vince can help you with that cost share with his Virginia Brownfield Assistance Fund money. So everyone call Vince for dollars is what I heard today.
And a lot of our communities are small rural communities in Virginia that apply. And so the waiver may be applicable because a lot of towns and and counties are struggling financially. So that's something you can always apply for. If you don't get it, then you tried, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Vince, I think you want to bring some more folks to our hypothetical stage.
Yeah, so in Virginia, we have a lot of really good brownfields consultants who actually write grants for folks. They do a lot of this for free. I didn't tell anybody that they write grants for free, but I pulled out a few of those folks for the call today, and there's some others that are on this webinar. So they probably introduced themselves earlier with their company name, but I'm going to start with Felicia Fred, who many of you know from EPA. Is Felicia here? I saw her on earlier. Unless we lost Felicia. Carrie, do you see Felicia?
I'm here. Sorry, I'm just not on screen. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you. So Felicia is formerly of EPA, and she has reviewed a lot of grants. And she retired, and luckily for us brownfielders, she decided to go put her services into the private sector now for Draper Hayden. And so Felicia is going to lead off. And what each of these folks are going to do is give a few tips, tricks, lessons learned, good, bad, the ugly, from their expertise. And then after that, we're going to do some more Q&A, and they'll help answer questions because, you got experts on the call. Why not let them answer questions? And then after that, I'm going to have Heather Kearney, who will then unmute herself and offer up some of the same assistance. She's with Environmental Standards, has written successful grants, EPA grants, and really knows the system as well. And then Joe Marisi, sorry, Joe, last but not least, Joe will get a chance to share some of his knowledge, and then we'll go into our Q&A. So take it away, Felicia. Take it away, Felicia.
Oh, you know what? You did not tell me this, and I'm sorry because you don't see me, but you guys know who I am, so you don't have to see me right now. I do look presentable though. Anyway, so tips and tricks. I moved my screen to my monitor, so it won't let you guys see me on my video, so you'll just have to hear my voice. Hi, everybody. This is interesting to be on the other side. You guys have done a great job, Gianna. Anyway, so tips and tricks. Some things that I think you guys should do. Start early. Do not wait to the last minute. Reiterate again to use Carrie and the new tab to review your proposal. This is like a research paper. So as you being so involved in it, you're into the details and you won't see those things that stick out to you that you may miss. But someone else reading it, putting another pair of eyes on it is really important. Don't assume that anybody knows your project. So you need to write this like you're writing it to someone that has absolutely no idea about your particular project. Don't make assumptions about anything, and be careful to answer all of the questions. And the last thing I'll say is if there is a sub-criterion that says and or, you do not have to respond to both. It's pick one and respond to that. And you'll understand what I mean by if you go through the guidelines and the sub-criteria, because there's several questions that say and or there's questions that say and. If it says A and D, you need to respond to both sections of that. That's it. It's my tips.
Thanks, Felicia. Do we have Heather, and are you ready to go?
Yep, I'm here.
All right.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Heather Tierney, and I work for Environmental Standards, a consulting firm out of Charlottesville. And I'm the team leader for our Virginia Brownfields practice. So I write these grant applications. I do the phase 1 and phase 2 ESAs, environmental site assessments, and then I also sort out what kind of remediation is appropriate based on what we find at the site, each site. So tips and tricks on the grant application process. I'd say that the biggest and most important challenge is choosing the narrative that you want to tell about your community and then weaving it through your application. So ask yourself, what is it about my community that makes it an attractive recipient for the funding? Does the community have health issues? Are the schools failing? Is there high unemployment? Or are there pockets of people in your community that are struggling with access to healthy food, high unemployment, access to healthcare? So once you've chosen that narrative, you go and find data to back it up. I mean, we've talked today already about some good sources of data. You've got the US Census data, the EJ screening tool. You can also go to your local health department data and pull on your community's comprehensive plan if they have that, because a lot of that will already be pulled together for you. But you need to use that data to back up your narrative. And then once you have that narrative selected, it's all well and good to lay it out, but you also need to tell the reader how using these funds is going to solve those problems. So focus on the outcomes. Will assessing or cleaning up those properties allow new businesses to move into neighborhoods and provide healthcare, provide healthy food? Will there be better access to education or transportation? So really look at who those most vulnerable people are in your community and how will this funding benefit them. Some other tips that that have already been hit on, again, start early. The sooner you finish that first draft, the longer you have to make revisions that are going to make it stronger. Really avoid fluff. So your writing needs to be concise and clear. And I can't stress enough about making sure you read that guidance carefully. Once you think you're done, go back and then go back again and check through that guidance and make sure every little detail has been addressed. And lastly, don't give up if you don't get the funding the first time. EPA will debrief with you and you'll find out what your score was, and they will help you improve it for the next round. And a lot of times, if you don't get it the first time, you'll be successful in times to come. So that's what I've got.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And you sound like you may have done this before, but so I think the nuts and bolts of the grant, if you really follow, EPA gives you lots of good direction. Nuts and bolts of it are not that hard. I mean, it takes time if you've never done this. But that art that some good grant writers have, and I'm not one of those, to take that, weave that story, take that thread from the start of the application to the end, and to show that reviewer how it's going to work and what the outcome, that's really the art of writing a successful grant. And I think a lot of people are good at it and can do it. And, and it's really a really cool thing to see. And we've had a lot of great grants like that. So, often there's examples out there of good grants that EPA's funded. I mean, I have no shame in copying off of somebody's paper that's out there publicly and available. So look at what people have been successful, have done, and imitate them. That's another tip that I would give. But
Yeah,
thank you for that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but on that note specifically, Kansas State University, who's the national tab provider, FOIA's all of the successful grant applications every year. And so they have even up to the most recent year successful grants on their website. And I can share a link with that in the chat as soon as I dig it up to show you, to see where you can just download those directly. And so you can look through and see and find ones from Region 3, ones from Virginia, things that would be most comparable to your application that might be helpful.
And that was very helpful the first time I tried to pull off writing a grant, because I had no idea what I was doing. So I needed some guidance on what other folks had done. It made it a lot easier.
I think those were excellent points made by Felicia and Heather so far. One thing to note, though, to be careful of with the FOIA and the successful applications is that the guidelines are tweaked each year. And so even though it's a perfect answer on one year, you really have to look closely at the RFA, the request for applications, and the guidelines, because sometimes it's a matter of the end or changing or really, really small details that you just want to be sure to pay attention to.
Yeah, we're not saying just copy and paste, but
That doesn't usually work.
definitely a good model, especially the sections that haven't changed. And you can see like something that EPA has liked and you know, put your own twist on it. But
And each year we do see applications that were copied and pasted even from the same applicant from previous years. And it becomes quite apparent once you get, you know, halfway in.
all right, so with, you know, now with Joe, are you there? I saw you on earlier. So
I am.
you can see Joe again here. He's one of the ours that have been, you know, visible. So Joe, go ahead and give your wisdom onto the group.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Marisi with Cardo, our regional Brownfields practice lead. We're your typical, you know, civil environmental engineering firm, but we have a specialty group that focuses on Brownfields practice and really helping communities secure this funding and managing the projects after the fact. I've been doing this for about 14 years, started down in the Carolinas and still work down there, as well as Virginia, West Virginia, and kind of Mid-Atlantic region. So I've had a lot of experience writing grants, had a lot of fun writing grants and working through this process. Both Heather and Felicia already gave some good tips, as well as Carrie and Gianna. So I'm just going to kind of hit and reinforce some of the things I think are really important. To build off what Gianna just said, you know, if you are resubmitting an application, be sure to go through and look at the changes. You know, each year EPA changes their priorities, and you can see those tweaks and what's the new, you know, focus area. For instance, last year was opportunity zones, or the last couple of years, you know, that's totally out of application now. So be sure even if you were close last year, you know, go back through and line by line through the guidelines and make sure that you're hitting the points they're asking for and eliminate the stuff they're not. You know, you don't have enough space, or you're limited to 10 pages. So don't, you know, put a lot of information in there that they're not asking for. Hit what the points that they ask for. And that goes for anybody. I think the best thing you can do if you're writing this application is to parse the guidelines line by line. You know, go back through every paragraph, every line, every comma, and make sure, you know, you're addressing those points. To build off kind of what Heather said, you know, about you know, telling your community story, I think it really starts at it if you can pick a really good site. And what I mean by a good site is it really needs to give them three components. One, you know, a site where you can clearly kind of define what the environmental risks are. You know, you can talk about its history and what the potential chemical or hazardous substance use was there. That, you know, kind of paint that picture of why there's some environmental concern associated with the site. And then two, there's you know, a describable impact to the community in terms of maybe an environmental threat or blight, or even, you know, what that you know, piece of property or once industry meant to the community. You know, was it the town's factory that, you know, 80% of the population worked for until it shut down and went overseas? You know, something that has a compelling story behind it that really talks about not only, you know, the environmental impact, but that community impact of that site. And then number three, it really, you know, should have some type of redevelopment potential that you can describe. You don't have to have a firm plan in place. If you know this is going to be, you know, bought by a developer and become a mixed use development or something like that, but something that you can paint that picture of what is the potential of this site? What could it be? What could it mean to this community? And then how do, you know, does that redevelopment of that particular site, you know, tie into some of the community needs and problems that you identify throughout the application? Because you want that consistent theme throughout each section of the application. So if you can build that story around one particular site or a couple sites, you know, and carry it through each section, you're going to have a much more successful application. So that's kind of, I think, the key to you know, most applications and getting the most points. You know, just pay attention to what they're asking and the point distribution. Kind of what Carrie was saying. You know, don't spend 2 pages on something that's only worth 5 points. You know, pay attention to how much they're weighting each section. And section 5 of the guidelines, you know, goes through, it kind of repeats the narrative criteria in a kind of a table format and breaks down the point distribution. So pay attention to that, go through that and make sure, you know, you're spending the time on the sections that count. A couple just random things that I'll address because some questions came up. Somebody was asking about site-specific applications. I would highly recommend that unless you're dealing with a major site that has, you're going to be dealing with a lot of assessment or less assessment costs and may even need that waiver, that if at all possible, go for the community-wide assessment. It's much more flexible. If something were to happen in the year it takes to get this grant for a site-specific application, and then you lose access to that, then that money you're just going to turn back into the EPA. You can't move the money to a different site. You know, most communities, even the smallest communities, have more than one brownfield site. So go for the community-wide application. You know, use that site as your focus area, and then if something does happen, you can shift those funds and use it somewhere else in the community. And then to tag onto Carrie's discussion about the programmatic capability and that last section where you talk about your past grant history and you have to answer one of the three. If you're an organization that has never managed funds, don't bother applying for an assessment grant. You're going to only get 8 points out of 15 and you lose 7. And in the current, past 5 years, you can't lose 7 points and still get funded. You need to find a way to either, answer the question that you've managed funds in some way and demonstrate that capability, or find some other eligible entity in your area that has managed funds that can apply for the grant and partner with them. If you answer, if you start to try to submit the application using that 4B3 section, it's unfortunately not going to be successful at the current funding levels. Now, if Brownfield suddenly gets a lot more funding and that score drops, where you can get funded, then it might change. But it's a killer if you can't do it. On the cleanup side, it's a little bit more difficult because the applicant has to own the property. So in that case, you need to find a way to answer one of the other 2 sections. I mean, whether it's a grant or a loan or something, show some kind of capability of managing funds to demonstrate your organization's ability to, responsibly take care of the funds that EPA gives you. And I think the last thing I'll do is, make it easy on the reviewers. Do not come up with your own format. Follow the guidelines, follow the breakdown, number every answer, according to the guidelines. So that when they're going through their review, they can easily find where the information is. And you'll see lots of examples out there of how that is. And of course, make sure it's the current guidelines, not the previous ones. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Joe. That was helpful. Don't try to use some weird, narrow font that EPA 1 doesn't want you to use. It's going to make your reviewer mad.
Thank you. I was thinking about that. Please don't condense your font and fit 2 pages in 1 page, because it does not make the reviewers very happy to have to magnify and try to read that.
They're reading a lot of proposals, so you want them to be happy and relaxed and love to hear your story. So
clear, nice concisiveness.
So I guess we're back to open format, Carrie. Question.
We are back.
Dropped in the link. So we talked about, so EPA had policy changes this year. They published those. And they also just published a guidelines summary PDF, which I've dropped into the chat. I like those for when I'm writing a proposal 1 year, and then the next year I'm trying to rewrite another one and see where those changes are. So you might want to grab that and look at that PDF.
Yes. So yeah, we have some more time for questions. So Vince and Gianna and I, and also the 3 folks you just heard from, can all chime in with your questions. I have one more thing to ask of you, which is that you do this quick post test that looks very similar to the one you took at the start. And this just helps us in our evaluation of the TAB services and how things went today, and helps us make sure that we are giving you the information that is useful to you and that we can build on moving forward.
Yeah, while you're answering those, I'll ask a question to the speakers today. So where have you seen like points lost that look like it shouldn't have been lost? Like there's no reason you shouldn't have gotten those points, and why that happened, in what sections. Anybody?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I am challenged because I can't get this back so you can see me, so you'll just hear my voice. In the community needs section, you tend to see points taken away if someone doesn't actually identify or state what the sensitive populations are in your particular community. That's a big one. The writers will go right into just talking about describing the community needs or responding to the question, but not actually identify the sensitive populations. And I would also say, because I'm like Carrie, I was a big proponent of the community outreach, glossing over that section and using it as a can without specifically stating what methods will be used to communicate or engage your community. And also what's been said earlier as to why those methods are important. And I think this year, because COVID has affected everybody, that it would probably behoove anyone who's writing to mention what other methods, that you use a hybrid. That's what I'm going to say. Not just one, that you actually use a hybrid form of communicating or engaging your communities.
Yeah, I think even if you're feeling optimistic that we will not be in the situation that we are in right now when your grant is awarded, what we've all learned from the past 18 months is the need to be ready to pivot, right? So demonstrating that you can pivot in any situation. Maybe there will be a natural disaster in your community that you would need to pivot around, or maybe there will be something else that's localized that means you need to do something differently. So I think being able to show that flexibility is something that we've all kind of learned, and that I expect us to continue to be asked about moving forward, not just by EPA, but by funders in general.
Gianna, did you have a tidbit here?
Yeah, I was going to follow up off what Felicia mentioned with the environmental threats and community need. So a lot of the times we see applicants come in and they do have a lot of contamination and environmental threats to the community and the sensitive populations in particular. But what tends to happen is it's kind of an overview of what's going on in the target area, and it's not tied to the priority assessment sites or cleanup sites that are being described. And so really making sure there's that link between the contamination at these sites or potential contamination and the sensitive populations and community need, making sure that's a cohesive tie together. And also project roles for project partners. It seems like an easy one that you have, again, it's not quantity over quality, but if you do have however many project partners you have, I've seen before in the past where it's just copy and pasted the project roles, and making sure that's more specific for each project partner, and making sure that they have meaningful involvement throughout different phases of whatever project you're proposing is important.
I think I would echo that. And one of the reasons why we shared that link to, I'm gonna go back to it really quickly. This link to the common environmental contaminants and health impacts is that if you are not an environmental scientist and you're writing this, you may not know off the top of your head what these different contaminants may cause in what impacts they may have to human health. And this is a nice little cheat sheet to help you know that. And then you can look at, I have used that to kind of help me know which sensitive populations I should be targeting, right? So if I know that there's a certain contaminant in the site I'm helping, what data do I need to look at? What do I need to talk about in my narrative? So that's a very helpful for that.
Anybody else have any other questions? Or if there's other people on the call, if you have some tip you want to share and you've written EPA grants, feel free to unmute, and you can unmute and ask a question if you have one as well. you don't always have access to the EPA folks once the grant is competition is announced. So this is one of your rare chance to ask questions. So, but you always have access to me, and I can try to answer questions by pulling in the knowledge I try to absorb from EPA on a weekly basis sometimes.
All these links and resources, all that information, is this available? How is this available, I should ask?
We'll send out a follow-up with the slides from today and a link to the recording once we can get the recording loaded in a way that's accessible. And then you'll have all of that.
That first link that I dropped recently, which is the EPA Brownfield Grant solicitation page, that is a wealth of information, and it has the guidelines, it has the summary of changes, the policy changes. You're going to want to bookmark that one if you're writing a grant, and you'll be back to those guidelines. They'll be your friend. So that's a big one. And then Carrie will send out the other resources we talked about. And I think maybe because there's some people that probably couldn't make this today that registered and wanted to be here, we might send out the recording link to everybody. Carrie, can we do that?
Yeah, we'll probably send the information to everyone who registered just to make sure everybody's got it. And I'm just going to change I'm getting some questions about that KSU tab, and it can be difficult to find. Unfortunately, I can't give you a direct link to those past proposals. So I'm just going to, can you see my browser now?
Yep.
Okay. So if you go to just ksutab.org and you click this resources button here and go to general, then it will load this, and you see here, this categories is where you want to go to this drop down menu, and then you'll see successful grant proposals going all the way back to 2012. Those, frankly, 2012 is not going to be very useful to you, but 2020 will give you, and then it'll reload, and you can see they've got them all here. And there's
Carrie,
other.
have you thought about posting a few successful Region 3 ones on your website? On your tab?
My WVU TAB website will hopefully be live on Friday when I'm officially the TAB provider. But yes, once we get ours live, we will we'll try to share some of those as well. And I'll share that website with you guys as soon as it's live as also. But there's other great resources from KSU TAB here as well, but you can kind of scroll through those.
Carrie, I'm sorry, this is Trisha. So when I go to that page, under resources, there's nothing. Like I just get that banner that has like that top of the building, but there's no search, there's no categories.
Here, that is very strange.
I don't get anything other than, I guess, that top picture.
I'm in Google Chrome, and it's working fine for me.
Yeah, it could be a browser issue, but if you drop your email in the chat, then I will email you and see if we can troubleshoot it afterwards.
Sure.
Go back to our slides. We do have another question from Beverly. The guidelines refer to cancer, asthma, birth defects, and health threats, but I was wondering if violent crime also counts as a health threat that can be addressed by the revitalization of target sites.
I would say yes. I think it is important to cover at least one of what the guidelines are asking for the cancer, asthma, birth defects as health threats. I think, I forget the wording exactly, but look at that closely. I think reviewers usually are looking for at least one of those factors or threats, but violence associated with these brownfield sites, I think would constitute that section as well.
Yeah, similar to that question, we have a lot of communities in Virginia and Appalachia and other places all across the country ravaged by the opioid addiction epidemic. And I think that may be an opportunity. You don't want to use too much space, but it may be worth noting in your grant if that's really affected that community. What are your thoughts on that, Gianna?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And I think if you're going to mention something besides what the guidelines are asking for, such as the violence or opioid problem, tie it to the sites as much as possible and how your projects would help alleviate these problems And the possible reuse would be very beneficial to that area.
An example of that would be, so there's a lot of studies that have shown abandoned buildings like are an attraction for crime. Could be drug use, drug sales, which are related to violent crime. So you could have a brownfield site that is an attraction for that kind of crime. So I think that would be an example of where you could actually tie that story together without just trying to stretch the truth.
Yeah, I think that second bit is very important, that you make sure you're tying it, because I have seen applications get hung up by that, right? So if you're going to talk about any, it doesn't have to be the ones we're talking about now. If you're going to talk about any health impact, then you want to follow up with how your grant's going to address that, right? Because if your grant's not going to address that health impact, then it doesn't really matter to the reviewers, right?
And I would do that after you check the boxes that EPA specifically asked for.
Yes.
So that plus, you know.
Yes.
And can I add that to that the example that you used, Vince? You also would then want to say that, say maybe a community center is the end use of it. So that's how you're tying it back to the benefit to the community. So if there is a drug problem, is there high crime, then your end piece to that is to say that this particular property could be turned into that, whatever that is, to, and then would reduce that crime. That's the other piece that ties it all together. Make sure you don't just describe it, but that you actually then say, what is the outcome or the benefit if this project is awarded, and what that would do for the community.
That's good, Felicia. That's that thread Heather was talking about. So you got to get it all the way through the application.
Yeah, it may seem so far away, that potential reuse and end use, but it is really important to try to explain what your vision is.
Yeah, you don't have to like say that we're definitely going to do this. It's like
Right.
vision. This is, you know, but because you're telling the story in an assessment planning grant that you're going to engage the community. You're going to make sure you have the right vision, but it is good to kind of show the reader, I think, that whole story.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I just echo that you're not, when you talk about what your vision is currently, you should be genuine that is your current vision. However, if your vision changes, just like if your target sites change, EPA is not going to be like, you're not committing by any stretch on this day that in 10 years your site is going to be a specific thing, and it can never be anything else because you wrote in this grant that it has to be, that it's going to be that thing. I've had applicants get hung up themselves, right, with being worried about writing that, and then how are they stuck? And you're not, right? You genuinely believe that that's what it's going to be, and it maybe is going to be that, but any number of things can happen, and everyone understands that, right? But if you have no vision, or you do not describe your vision because you're worried about that, then it's going to hurt your application.
Yeah, not everybody understands that. That's a good point, Carrie, because I was working with my local partners to write a DEQ grant for a target area, and they gave me sites, and then we wrote the grant, and we chose the sites that best tell the story to help get the grant. And then some of the partners they read that and they were like, hey, but we wanted to do this first. This was more important. And I had to go back and re-explain that you're not married to every one of these sites. If something changes, we don't have to stick to the exact plan. I think that's important to understand. Use the sites that really tell what your priorities are, but you're not married to them throughout the 3 years or 5, whatever the grant period is.
Yeah, we understand that this is an application proposal. So this is not set in stone. Obviously, you can't come in requesting a budget and then completely change it when it comes time to getting the award process, but that would not work. But if there's minor tweaks and, a lot of things can change over the course of 6 months to a year. So we know that. And so don't overthink if something is that it's going to be set in stone, because it's not the case.
Yeah, we've had communities get a VBAF grant to move on one of their key sites while they're waiting because it was high priority.
Mm-hmm.
We've even helped them get an EPA targeted brownfield assessment that EPA does in the interim because it's a high priority. So we understand, and EPA understands there's changes. Any more questions from the audience?
don't have any in the chat, but we'll do a final call if you want to put one in or if you want to unmute yourself.
You know, I thank everybody for coming, and I really think it's important to listen into these so you can get, get your grant over the top. And if you feel like you're not ready, this year for some reason, then you can really start thinking about next year now and working with, EPA and TAB provider and us to really formulate a plan to be successful for next year's grant. If the infrastructure bill passes, we could have a lot of money over the next few cycles for brownfields at the federal level. So it's a good time to be thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would say, generally, if you just have one site that you're interested in assessing, we didn't talk a lot about the Targeted Brownfields Assessment Grant, and I think Vince has some assessment money himself. If you just have one small site that you're interested in assessing, you may not want to go for a whole big site-specific or community-wide assessment grant, and you should reach out to your state folks to see if there may be other options for how to get that site assessed.
Or Gianna, because EPA does the Targeted Brownfield Assessment program is really good.
Mhm.
And if you're not in a super big hurry, they can get you on the list to have EPA will come in and assess that site at a really high level and do a really good job. And then they give you that grant, and they also provide you guidance with next steps. Like, here's an EPA cleanup grant. Here's, they understand our state resources, and we can partner with you on that too. And if you're more comfortable coming to me, I can help facilitate you to EPA with that. Or Gianna would be also willing to put you in contact with that person.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Vince. The technical brownfield assessments are on a rolling basis, and the applications are not nearly as thorough as these grants. They're not technically grants. We provide the contractual work and expenses, and the TBAs are a great way to get your foot in the door and familiar with this type of work. And you have the EPA contact information, and it's a great way to kind of segue into grants.
Yeah, it would definitely look good on your, especially the first time you go after a grant, if you've done one of those, or you've done the Brownfields grants in Virginia. So.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and look for some follow-up information from either me or KDC in the next week or so with all of this information. And if you think of anything, you can always reach out to one of us. There's our contact information for all three. And we look forward to lots of grants from Virginia this year.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.